Caribbean Policy Development Center, in collaboration with the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit, and WhyTV, have partnered on a project titled Voices of Women, which seeks to highlight women from Barbados and the wider Caribbean, reflecting on their work in 5 areas: education, community development, development work, healthcare, and politics. Voices of Women play an integral part in ensuring that the oral history of the Caribbean woman is well remembered by allowing the chosen women to tell their stories from their views. Today on Voices of Women, we highlight Cecilia Babb. Welcome to WhyTV, Voices of Women. My name is Karen Phillip from Caribbean Policy Development Center, and today I'm here with my guest, Cecilia Babb. Welcome. Feel free to tell us a bit about yourself.
Good morning. Thank you, Karen, for having me on this program, and thank you to everybody who's going to listen to the program. The connection here would be Caribbean Policy Development Center. I did work with the institution for some 20 years, its first 20 years. I am originally at least born in Dominica, but I have lived in Barbados for half my life and worked throughout the Caribbean. So I'm Dominican born, Barbadian resident, and Caribbean woman by choice.
That sounds nice. So when you say Caribbean woman by choice, that means you believe in regional integration?
Well, very much so. And, you know, when you look at the differences in our ages, I can tell you a lot of stories about when we did have Caribbean integration. Okay. So my favorite one is to go to the federal boats, the federal maple and the federal palm, that took us up and down the region, took all the cargo up and down the region that connected people in the days when we had one currency. Okay. And, you know, many things that we're striving for in regional integration now. Actually, we had good roads into it then and a reality then.
Okay. So we're going to talk about a little bit about CPDC and that you were one of the founding staff members. You want to tell us how that was for you, that experience?
To say founding staff members is a little grand, a little pompous, Karen, because really I came to CPDC because I did apply for the job and I got it a little later than when I applied for. But to speak of founding members, staff members would really be to speak about the persons who brought CPDC into being. And while I learned the story as an early staff member, you really have to give credit to Reverend Alan Curtin from the then Caribbean Conference of Churches. It was his idea to form a policy unit within the CCC. And as the idea got discussed throughout the region with the rest of the NGO community over a two-year period, it actually came into being and took place, started up as an office within CCC in February of 1991. So I wasn't a founding staff member, that's taken up a bit too much credit. But yes, I was there when we had like the old Remington typewriter and such things.
So, okay, well then tell us a bit more about your 20 years there. Within that time, you dealt with Carib Clips and then evolved into Caribbean Beacon. What was your role?
The resort debt, let's start with why CPDC was founded. The understanding at the time and the Caribbean conjuncture at that time was one of debt and structural adjustment. And Caribbean thinkers, Caribbean intellectuals, people who had been trained at universities overseas and were coming back to make their contribution to the region, well, they were appalled at the way in which the project of independence and development was being hijacked. Mm-hmm. And so put their heads together to look at that whole situation of debt and structural adjustment, how different countries had become indebted, and what the effects of having to, one, contract this debt and then to repay the debt meant in social, economic, cultural, and very human terms. And so the first work of CPDC really was to do that analysis, and its launching pad was the Regional Economics Conference that was held in Trinidad and Tobago, mm-hmm. and convened by CARICOM. The NGOs in a sense, hijacked the event because initially NGOs were not included in that event.
Okay.
What they did, though, was to use the linkages as you work at CPDC, so you know we're very resourceful, and found the way on the agenda and presented on every topic. And out of that came CPDC's first publication, Challenges in Caribbean Development, which is the platform document that speaks to a range of development issues. Carib Clips came as a way of continuing to monitor what is happening in the region. So it was a regional integration tool in the sense that it gave you a picture from country to country as far as the information became available of common trends, what is happening on those issues of debt, of structural adjustment, of regional integration, what are some of the issues that are pertinent for people and for countries and for policymakers.
Okay, and then how did that evolve into Caribbean Beacon?
Well, as we discussed, the foundation document is the Challenges in Caribbean Development. And while Carib Clips gave you a snapshot, you know, just as what is being reported and what's the information that is available to people, you needed to do an in-depth analysis of those issues. And therefore, the Caribbean Beacon came in as a way, a policy magazine, so it could delve into issues in more depth and bring an analysis to a particular readership that was interested in that kind of material.
Okay, and I know your focus is on gender and gender issues, so a lot of the articles that you will find in the Caribbean Beacon, like the one on the EPA, was how does gender intersect with EPA? But why to you is it so important to speak on the gender or use a gendered lens? Okay,
let me step back and say my focus has been on women. Women's rights, that women's rights are human rights, and that every aspect of our national life affects women, and therefore women's viewpoints should be considered, the impact of policies and programs on women's lives, and women at all levels. There's a way in which we objectify poor women and we say poor women, but it's women at all levels. Because of the fact that we walk in a female body, there are certain constraints and opportunities that we encounter that have to be dealt with as women. So my focus has been women and continues to be. However, the language has changed over time. And as we look at the complexity of the issues that face women, we recognize the need to look not only at the lives of women, but the lives of men as well, and how those interrelate and intersect at different levels of age, of class, of ethnicity, of race, of ability, and a whole number of other variables. So my focus has always been on women, because during the, I would have to step back to speak to that, but let me stay with CPDC. During the analysis of the impacts of structural adjustment and the impacts of debt on the lives of ordinary people, it was necessary to look at what is happening to women, because women are so central to the household, to the family, to the society. And in looking at what was happening to women, what the implications of structural adjustment, debt repayment, high debt ratios, the implications of that for women was a central part of that analysis.
Okay. I know some of the projects that you've worked on, but is there any specific one that stands out in your mind that you think highly of, that was an enjoyable experience for you to work on?
Well, in the context of CPDC, yes.
It doesn't have to only be on CPDC. As your work as a gender activist.
Okay, which allows me to step back from CPDC a bit, because I really got my first stirrings about the lives of women looking at my mother's life.
Okay.
The books that I read in high school did not in any way reflect life in Dominica, and it certainly didn't reflect the life of the women who made me who I am today. So I was always concerned, why did these books speak about, you know, the English heather and the summer breeze and all of that? As I sat in Convent High School and looked out at the botanic gardens, or in convent primary school and looked out at the sea and watched the waves rolling in, you know. To me, there was so much beauty around, but no, it wasn't in the books I read. And I read about other things, but I never read about the lives of the women. I looked at my mother, who, by ethnicity, she's a woman from the First Peoples, the Kalinago territory, or at least the Kalinago people. And I wondered why the only thing that was said about, we were called Caribs then, was that they were fierce and warlike. You're defending what is yours and you're fierce and warlike, and there was nothing else. So I always had this preoccupation, why is it that books did not reflect the lives of women? And that's where my engagement started. My first job was in teaching, but I moved from that to research and development in the banana industry, and that took me around the island of Dominica, of course. And what was most enjoyable for me in that job was encountering women farmers. And understanding from my grandparents, you know, my grandmother on my paternal grandmother was a farmer. But understanding the sense of independence, the resourcefulness, the joy, the ability to laugh at difficulties and keep going, the vision that people had for their children in the midst of very limited circumstances and huge challenges. But it just expanded for me all the time, an appreciation of women, an enjoyment of the capacities of women, and that has stayed with me. So while I try to weave it into the gender paradigms and, you know, the scholarship and all of that, central for me always is woman.
I just want to go back a bit to the Kalinago heritage that you have. Might be a little off topic, but do you think that is enough being done in the Caribbean to recognize the First Nations' contributions to society?
Well, no, it's not being done. And at CPDC, one of the founding members of CPDC was the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous People.
Yes, and they just...
They
just won, not one, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is going to give them a holiday, which is the first time in the history of Trinidad and Tobago that they get an official
Right, and
holiday.
they have been, the Santa Rosa community has been fighting for that. Well, I shouldn't use the word fight, but they have been advocating and lobbying for that for more than 10 years. So it comes now, and it's welcome that it has come. The Kalinago people, if you think about it, as the first peoples of the region, the indigenous people, indigenous itself is a bad word, because what's the etymology of the word indigenous? It's indigent. So if you understand the politics of language, you step back from that and you unpack it and you have a difficulty. I do. I have a difficulty with the terminology, but that's what people understand, so we're going to use it. The first people of the region, if I can return to the Caribs, had a republic that stretched from Trinidad to Puerto Rico. Most people wouldn't know that. The Taino people had a republic that stretched from Santo Domingo to the Bahamas, the Yucatan, and so on. Yet when we come and we write policy in this day and time for a Caribbean single market and economy, and we think about freedom of movement, the first peoples of the region did not get first priority to travel around the region. So when I say enough isn't being done, from things as fundamental as recognizing that this is a right and a freedom that was taken from these people, do we have a basis for identifying them specially and thinking that they have a contribution to make to Caribbean economies? Of course we should. And if we think about it, then we see endless possibilities and endless linkages with their original way of life, some of which has been sustained, and problems that we have now. But I forgot to take the discussion to the project at CPDC that I enjoyed the most. And that was the women in politics, engendering local government. It started with the thinking of engendering local government by just the simple thought that we need more women exercising leadership beyond the community level. because you find women do a lot of voluntary work and they get elected as the workers in the organizations. So the secretaries and the treasurers and the leaders of the working groups are always women. But then women's leadership seems to stop there. We managed to have women councillors, a few women councillors. In countries where you have local government systems functioning, you will get some women leaders. But what about in the highest structures of decision making? Women are woefully absent there, or the numbers are inadequate. So that was a drive at the time to expand the thinking. It wasn't new thinking, but it was a new project that we did with the support of the then Gender Equality Fund, and partners like Frederick Ebert Stifter with Judith Wedderburn, and the Trinidad and Tobago Network for the Advancement of Women with Hazel Brown, and so on. I retreated from the project as I came to appreciate more and more that women do not get into the upper leadership positions through NGOs. Okay. They do so through political parties, and therefore it had to be a case of working more deeply with political parties to reform the thinking within political parties, and that's a larger
issue.
Yeah.
Also, you worked on the gender-aware policy making in the Caribbean, a manual. You want to tell us a little bit about this one?
The two projects are linked. When we thought about, those of us who were conceptualizing the project, when we thought about women's leadership, we asked ourselves the question naturally, if women come to leadership, what difference will it make? It has to make a difference, not because women are responsible to change the world, but because women can change the world. And so, if we were dissatisfied with the fact that there were insufficient women in leadership, what was the value added that women would bring? And therefore, we worked on two tracks in this project. One, to get people to see women as viable candidates, and the other, for women to see themselves as astute, efficient policymakers. And this is where the policymaking tool came into being.
Okay. And so this speaks a bit about your work as a writer, as in you've written these manuals and you've helped collected the books. Is this something that you enjoy doing, or it was something that was natural progression?
Again, I need to give credit where credit is due. If you look at any of the documents, you see that they're all collaborative efforts. It's never something that I did or I did by myself. So really and truly, it was in the case of the policy manual, it was the strategic support from Frederick Ebert Stifter that brought that into being. Dr. now Professor Patricia Mohammed was the main writer for it. And as we used it in training, Pat, Judy, and I, we looked at areas that could be strengthened and we worked on it. But that was a collaborative effort. And all of the policy magazine.
Of a puzzle, an essential part.
All of the stuff that we wrote, other people had to send in materials. We had to collaborate. None of it is by myself.
Okay, so now we could talk a bit more about your contemporary activism. I know you're part of the Caribbean Rastafarian organization, particularly the Barbados chapter, I believe.
Oh, well, let's see. First,
okay.
I'm a Rastafari woman, Rastafari to the bone.
Yes.
This is my defining philosophy. This is my worldview. This is what I live by from day to day, minute to minute, hour to hour. This is who I am, Rastafari. Of Kalinago extraction, of African ancestry, and I cannot ignore the stain in my blood, the experience of enslavement, how that came about, and so, but essentially that's who I am. In terms of being linked to an organization at the regional level, I am a trustee of the Caribbean Rastafari organization, and at the national level, I am a member of the Rastafari Reparations Repatriation Working Group. I also represent the Rastafari community on the government's official task force on reparations. So I have linkages at those various levels.
Tell us a bit more about the working group and your part.
The Rastafari Reparations Repatriation Working Group was a natural follow-through on our essential philosophy that people of African ancestry, especially those in the Caribbean, but everybody outside of Africa, who in some way through their generations experienced enslavement, ought to be compensated for the labor that we put in at a minimum, for the extraction of resources outside of, taken out extraction of resources from Africa that has led to some of the conditions in which Black people find themselves the world over, that has to be compensated at a minimum. And as Rastafari in particular, we wish to return home to the land from which we were taken. But indivisible is the fact that if we are to return home, we do not return home as refugees, but that we return home as a free people, as a dignified people, able to contribute to the societies that we will return to. So repatriation with reparation is inseparable. It's one concept. And we've always worked on that, and Rastafari has taken initiatives to write directly to the Queen of England because we live in an English-speaking area. And Rastafari in other language groupings have written to the appropriate head, requesting, demanding, putting reparations on the table. The working group came about as a natural follow-through to the fact that in 2011, when we formalized as a group, the year had been declared by the UN as the International Year for People of African Descent. Now, this is a mobilization that started at the level of civil society in the World Conference Against Racism held in South Africa in 2001, of which we were very much a part. So we formed that group because it seemed to us an opportune time to do it. And then shortly after, other events brought the issue of reparations into prominence here in the Caribbean and then globally.
Okay. So you spoke about your mother and your aunt being an influential woman in your life, but are there any other people that you would see were influential in your shaping?
Oh yes, oh yes. I'm very much a product of the mobilization, the advocacy, the scholarship, the thinking. There's a Caribbean woman whom I'll name in a short while. She always says, you know, you have to hurt your head to think through those things in a logical, in a balanced, but in a very frontal way on those issues. So my involvement in the women's movement really depends very largely and is thanks to people like Joan French, Judy Wedderburn, Peggy Antrobus, Rowida Baxterdin, Eudine Barriteau, a whole slew of women across the region, Rhoda Reddock and other such women, who pioneered and babied and carried an organization called the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. And that organization was formalized in 1986, but it had gone through a period, an incubation period. But we must be mindful that these organizations build on earlier efforts of other women. We never emerge in and out of ourselves. They're always, if we dig, and we'll find efforts that went before. So the women who were an essential part of the mobilization of labor in the 1930s, who fought for trade unions and for the formation of political parties, their streams flow into the tributary that, you know, we have become. Those movements are not separate and distinct from each other. I was just doing some research on domestic workers. I was looking at legislation for domestic workers and found out that there was a domestic workers trade union in Guyana in the 1950s. So, you know, there's a legacy of women organizing and doing that we sometimes don't know if we don't tell the story. So CAFRA would have been a natural follow-through from earlier movements. But yes, certainly there are women who I hold dear, who have been teachers, who have nurtured me in many ways through scholarship, through their activism. 1975, International Women's Year, I first learned the name Peggy Antrobus, and I thought, this woman is brave. Things that I had thought about, been concerned about, couldn't speak to anybody about. There she was on the television just speaking it out, and I just thought, wow. It happened that 10 years later, I was sitting next to her and we were working together. And she shepherded and taught me to understand the economy as something that women do every day in their households, and that macroeconomic policy is very much linked to the daily lives of women, to how women function in their reproductive sphere, in their productive sphere, in their voluntary sphere. And that understanding of structural adjustment from a gender standpoint, a woman standpoint, Peggy made me understand that in very simple and clear terms.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know for me, you have mentored me in some aspect, even though I came in when you were leaving or
I had left
CPDC, but yet I know I could pick up the phone and call you. Do you also do that with other people? That is you the same way?
Whenever people ask, I try to be useful. I am not an initiator. I know that's really dull and boring. I'm not an initiator. I don't go out there and start this movement and start this group and start this very great thing. But if people come to me, if they pick up the phone, if they send an email, if they stop me on the street, whenever I'm asked, I try to respond in a responsible way. But I don't go out there and try to form groups or start any movements or anything. Yeah, so I give because so much has been given to me. So much has been given to me over the years. The work experience, 20 years at CPDC, made me interface with so many aspects of Caribbean development and understand them and not be confounded by them. Just recently, I sat down during the conference of the Barrow Association here in Barbados. And the discussion, as part of a presentation, centered around the fact that we have more law schools cropping up in the region. In another area, you would hear about these various universities, offshore universities. Having worked at CPDC, I understood very easily, that's the liberalization of education, health, and other services way back, via the WTO. So that experience has been such rich enough and complete enough and profound enough that I have a responsibility to pass it on to others when they ask.
Okay. So my last question for you is, if you had one message to give to other young women coming up, what would you tell them?
I would tell them the same thing like my mother told me. That women must work on their economic security. You must have your own money, you must make your own decisions, and you must never hesitate to help where you can.
Thank you very much for your time. I am Karen Phillip, and I have been interviewing Cecilia Babb about her legacy within the Caribbean. Thank you for watching WhyTV.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this program. Remember, you can watch this and all our programs on our website, www.huetv.org, available anytime, anywhere, and on any device. Also, join the conversation on social media by visiting our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages.